Great to see everyone. Welcome. Uh, we do have some presenters today leading the first discussion, which will be on TPRS. I don't think I see any of them yet. They must be in the midst of their final preparations, perhaps. While they're doing that, let me just sort of visit this sign-in sheet real quick. Oh, where'd it go? And while we're looking at that, so here's what I've got so far. So Kochin, Kachtzin, and Naweya today. Nilatoka, Selectina, Duck Juice 2 weeks from now on Where Are Your Keys? Hokyunsk and Sani talking about accelerated second language acquisition, which is also known as the gray morning method. Then we have Lauren and Lori talking about the Paul Creek method on the 17th. December 1st, Suzuk and Kachkun on adult immersion program. I would recommend you're looking at Mohawk and Coast Salish. And then Sanjat and Kaskatin on the 8th for the final one, language medium education, where I would recommend you're looking at Hawaii and Maori and maybe Sami. Anybody not see their name on here that you want to throw your name on there? Is everybody? I think everybody might be on there. Okay. Next is an announcement. So on Monday, which is Indigenous Peoples Day, we're going to do things a little bit different and shake it up. And we're going to have a panel that's going to share some of their thoughts with us. The panel is still being assembled. I do believe I've got confirmation from Joel Isaac, who works in Denina, and from Roy Mitchell, who works for the Alaska Native Language Preservation and Advisory Council, and Larry Kimura, who is the grandfather of the Hawaiian language revitalization movement. Very excited that Larry can join us. And we're just going to sort of share their thoughts. And we're also going to invite the public in to just hang out with us and see if folks want to listen to these conversations, participate. I'll be working with the presenters, the panelists. It's going to be pretty informal, but I'll be working with them to figure out how they want to structure that in terms of presenting anything that they would like to share with us, and then opening it up to you folks primarily for question and answer, and then maybe allowing the public to, it's not like set up like a presentation or anything, so everybody will just be here. I don't know how many folks will show up, but we're trying to open the campus up a little bit for Indigenous Peoples Day. There was a talk about like, well, it's been Indigenous Peoples Day, shouldn't we just stay home and just be Indigenous or have some kind of potlatch where people are serving us cool stuff and spoiling us rotten instead of working extra hard, but you know, we'll figure that out. Maybe that's the future. The Chancellor of UAS, Karen Carey, though, does want to make sure that we're celebrating and that we're doing something just to acknowledge the shift. And that includes sharing some of the history of how it came to become Indigenous Peoples Day in Alaska, which I'll just watch for what the current Alaska Governor's Office does for Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm guessing it might go by pretty quietly. However, we're going to do some stuff, and we're also going to celebrate, hopefully, some of our achievements and accomplishments and help each other out and talk about being stewards of our languages, drawing inspiration from other folks. And the title of the panel is going to be The Future of Indigenous language revitalization in Alaska. Any thoughts on that? Everybody okay with that? Any objections?
Have like a march or something to show we're still here.
That'd be nice. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there will be some other things going on. Um, it's a little bit hectic this year. I don't know. Kind of just we've been talking about events. There will also be a 9 a.m. Discussion if you folks want to attend. Uh, let me put the link to that one in the chat. So we're also inviting another panel. Oh, I can't look at it from here, can I? Oh, there it is. I can't click and talk at the same time. So we're also having a morning panel that we're calling Katukaksa towards the river that untangles a person's mind. And we've invited a couple of folks, Laganai, Liz Medicine Crow, and Chachi Ish, Richard Peterson, and Kuchain, who's in our class, and myself, also Dachkit Ach, Colleen James, and Ida Heather Burge, to just have a conversation about, I'm going to share a Raven story. Kuchain is going to talk about the history of Indigenous Peoples Day as far as from a perspective of the University of Alaska Southeast, when we get to see some of this stuff, I think, move forward a few years ago. And it used to be someone else's day, but I don't want to talk about that person. And so it's become Indigenous Peoples Day. And there's some conversations to be had about where things go from here. But then Liz Medicine Crow is going to talk about the term unceded when we talk about unceded territory in the land acknowledgement. And Richard Peterson's going to talk about tribal sovereignty, which for some Alaskan politicians is like a bad word, but I think it's a great pair of words. And so that's kind of what we're going to do. Colleen is going to do an opening ceremony, probably a song, and then Ida will give us some closing thoughts. So that one's at 9 a.m. I put the link in the chat. I could put it back in there if you like. We're also going to be publicizing this a little bit over the next few days. So that's the morning event. And the afternoon event is our class. We're going to open it up to the public so that we can have a dialogue. We're going to have a panel, and we'll hear from the panel. I'm hoping a couple other people will hop onto it. Just sort of reached out to some folks in my network of colleagues that work in language revitalization, just to see if some folks want to come and share their thoughts with us, and also to have share the link pretty broadly and see if other folks come and hang out and drum up some interest for some of the statewide language revitalization initiatives. And I'll share some of my ideas, which are primarily pathway to teacher certification and licensure, including Alaska Native languages and state standards of education, restoring Alaska Native place names, and then constructing more language nests and language medium schools and dual language schools. So, any other thoughts on that stuff? So, for a lot of us, every day is Indigenous Peoples Day, but Monday will especially be Indigenous Peoples Day. I know in Canada, boy, they really make a thing of it. They have the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, which I would like to talk a little bit more about steps we could take to create an Alaska Native Language Media Network, which I think could be something similar to APTN or OEV TV or Maori TV. Irish, they do theirs through BBC, I think the British Broadcasting Corporation or whatever it is. And they're creating a lot of content. And so I got to see some soap operas, basically, and dramatic television programs that are in Gaelic. And I think OEV TV does a lot of documentary work. I'd be really interested in developing what I would envision is sort of a statewide entity in partnership with the Alaska Native Language Center and some other folks that kind of has a team of filmmakers, that has a team of um, so folks who could do audio and video, both recording and editing, and then final sort of production, and then having a team that could do publishing, and then having a team that sort of can do illustration and perhaps even animation. And then we sort of grow this team and start working on some projects within our languages. And then the idea is as they sort of do projects, they also help to spread the knowledge of how to do this stuff. So we can create more Alaska Native illustrators, more Alaska Native filmmakers, more Alaska Native content creators, publishers, who are really focused on doing things in our languages. So that's kind of another sort of thing that I'm working on. Kind of, those are probably the four main things. I didn't really count them, but those are the main things that I'm working on and trying to figure out how to sort of turn those from a vision to a reality. Because I think if we had that like at a statewide level, then we could send the team to various language communities to go make some stuff. One of the keys is going to be making sure that there's equity. So what if Eyak wants stuff and Han wants stuff and Dekitan wants stuff and Inupiaq, it's making sure that it's not all just one particular language. Because sometimes once we get started, some folks have a lot of energy and they seem really ready, but then also they're just well connected with the folks who are doing the thing. And so I have seen some statewide working groups that are not being totally inclusive when we talk about making sure each language is represented and has an opportunity. And so, in particular, I would say sometimes the interior Dene languages are kind of left out of some of these activities and ideas. And those are things I think we should also be talking about. Any other thoughts? Is our TPRS team ready? You guys need
I had a thought on that, like, in building up, having a network. I mean, like the things that we teach kids in classes could be, benefiting that show or that play or something, like, have them making props so like they can do it, or they can provide some of the stuff that they make for them. That way it's not like you got to pay an artist to make the shakate that we're going to use in there or whatever, and then like how we're making them, all that stuff should definitely be shared. And I talked to Aya and Ki about he's had so many people in his class, like they want to make something from their clan and it's not anywhere. It's, you got to be like an anthropologist just to look up where these things are, where they come from, their history, and like that could be in one place for us to share around everywhere. It should be.
Yeah, like and so like as especially like if you start really focusing on content creation, then I think a really fascinating idea would be one, like let's write some grants and then we go buy some camera gear and then we bring it into a community and we make some projects and we say, okay, that's your camera gear. We did this project, we showed you how to work it. It comes with all the cases and everything you need. I know there's a million different things to get, but just sort of coming up with these kind of a gear kit that can go with the community. And then I think you're right on. So there's some stuff that the group would be making for the general public to generate interest, to normalize languages, to also probably help fund other things. Because once you start showing videos of these little babies speaking the language and stuff, and you start really saying things like, we haven't had kids that have spoken our language in 60 years. The tears start flowing and hopefully the pocketbooks start opening up. Because then I would say the majority of the content you're producing, hopefully, is specifically for the language community. So video lessons, stuff to send home to families, all this stuff to just help them put the language into their own home if it's not there already. And then, yeah, all the things, if you need to make props for things, if you need to make artwork and other things for some of these productions, that also stays in the community. And so, because one of the things I could say from the perspective of people of Southeast Alaska is you go to so many different museums, the Penn Museum, uh, National Museum of the American Indian, uh, the one in the Burke, the Denver Museum, and any one of those museums has so much more of our particular stuff, like Tlingit stuff or Haida stuff or Tsimshian stuff, than our own communities back home. And so that also is that's another sort of thing, but one part of it could be as we engage in content creation and we start making language materials. Like the thing I really loved about watching a presentation about the history of material development among the Hawaiians was how it just became more and more Hawaiian. Because if you keep translating the books that are out there, um, let me show you guys a graphic real quick. I gotta find it. I did this presentation a while back called Artful Literacy. And while putting the slides together, I found this slide. So diversity in children's books. So if you analyze children's books, this was done in 2015 by the University of Wisconsin at Madison, their School of Education. 73% of the characters in books, in children's books, are white. 12.5% are non-human, so animals, trucks, stuff like that. 7.6% African American, 3.3% Asian Pacific Islander, 2.4% Latinx, 0.9% American Indian or Native American. So these are some things we have to think about as well as we want this content to really be, we want our people to be able to see themselves in the material, and we want them to be doing things that we are doing. So as I was raising our three kids in our language, and we still are, but when I started to read books to them, I would translate them. And sometimes I would just say, this book is because I wouldn't always read them before, like life is busy. You just grab some books and just grab it off the shelf. Or we're in that really cool Dolly Parton program, and Dolly Parton should probably be the queen of the world. I don't know. She's so like generous. But she developed this program where you mail out books to people who have kids. And so we just got tons and tons of books by enrolling in that program, which we found through our local Juneau library. And but sometimes I would just read the book, and if it's a couple of things, if the whole thing is built upon a rhyme pattern or some sort of, so much of it has to do with the prosody of English, which is like da 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 da. It's all about the rhythm of the language. So sometimes when you translate it, you're like, well, this is kind of it's not a great story. But then other times too, there's these kind of tropes like the bad kid who finally turns good, or all these. There might be certain things I just don't like, or would read them once and I just sort of give it away, or get rid of it. But then it was always sort of like they had nothing to do with us and our people. So things like the Baby Raven Reads program was really refreshing, because even if initially those books were in English, I could just read them and translate them as we go, which is we've got a working group that's been doing stuff, and we're trying to create more books. But I think really like who's going to do the illustration, and then who's going to do the putting it together. Because the one thing that you often want is you want your kids to be able to see, well, the books that our people make are the same high quality as other people. So, you can create a little bit of a differentiation if you have like really nice kids' books in English about non-Indigenous stuff, and then ours are like stapled paper, which is what ours were for a long time. But then what they did in Hawaii is they developed some ways of growing their own illustrators and developing their own content and putting their own stories in there. And it's wonderful. And some of these, then you got to decide too, like, is this for everybody or is it just for us? Because I think there's positives and negatives for each of those. Other thoughts? TPRS gang, you ready? Okay. Well, I'll turn it over to you folks. I'm going to get up so the light turns back on. Take it away.
We didn't get to go over, I guess who wanted to go first, but I'll jump in ahead, if that's okay with you, Noah. Okay, so I put a few different things together. I think Kuchain, Kutsnubuyuk, Ayanki, they're working on a Yauk right now. So I think he's gonna try to make it in, but that aside, I'll share this. Some of the notes that I put together on teaching was from from this document here. Oh, we'll share the wrong one. Sorry. Leichtman research on TPRS, and it's a little bit older, but I think a lot of it is still pretty relevant. I'm sure it is. A lot of the stuff too we've been talking about in some of our other classes, and some of the more what I was wanting to go through on here was the studies that they did on TPRS and how some of their students just overall tested better than other students who had normal instruction in a class. So two different methods were tested, and the control group, the regular standard test, learning and education, they did good the first time around, but overall, the after the mid test and the advanced test, the TPRS surpassed them by far, and they just overall retained a lot more knowledge than the rest of the class. And there's another, it's a video that I wanted to share as well. Which I don't have up. But it's a video that was, it was right after COVID struck, and then it was school year. And this teacher, Miss Martin, Navajo language class, she put this together, and it was a whole lot of the class was conducted through this, so kids were able to navigate the different sections of the class. And this is kind of like a video of what the kids were able to do, but it was kind of set up in a way using TPRS. And I'm just going to stop talking now and play this short clip.
Altsasho, di sad ko esen niligi, altsapetahodil alia. Di sad, shikek ehope at a tornido lil. Yeah, da. Yes, cargo. Ad. Adada. O al. Nt Gunne. Dolel. Di sad betahwil yeah. Belaganak etche alto ataulianigi tabakha. Di benatche kwaegi na benotcha do chodenol idolelkat. Practice adahle kad. Yes cargo. Di etche kad. Adada. Yeah, da. O al. Nt Gunne. Dolel. Disad.
So it kind of goes on quite a ways. It's pretty good video. Just showing how to use their language. I mean, she was just talking and she didn't really explain what things were, but I think you kind of got the gist of it. It's practicing connecting the lines to these dots, and the rest of it too was really great, and it kind of it used some English throughout, but it was pretty minimal throughout the whole thing, and I thought it was a great method of I haven't seen anybody else's class quite like that, which I thought was awesome. And this is the second year of their class, so
Wow. Okay.
that's all I have on my section.
Geesh.
Okay, I can share a little. Let's see here. So for those of us who are in the Hayuk Atungi Dei program, we got to go through a TPRS training this last, I don't know when it was. It feels like, I don't know, sometime during the pandemic. I went through a training on this. And I really liked it. It's a really cool. So it stands for teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. And this is a handout from that. So some of the things that they talk about are like needing rich input, which is like an acronym, and they've got a bunch of what is it? It's like repetitive, interesting, C and H. Oh, I can't remember. And then I liked though a lot of I liked it a lot because they use these things here. Oops. These techniques I really liked, especially the like asking questions and circling. So like you're supposed to, like you have on the screen, as a teacher, you have like, or whatever, wherever it is, I don't know. I mean, I'm just assuming we all do everything in Zoom now, huh? So on the screen, you have like a picture that depicts like the thing that you're trying to talk an illicit language about. And then you like you just like say the same phrase over and over, but use the same words in different orders to ask the same thing. And then, the answer is always the same answer. And so like if we were doing this one in Spanish, hay una chica. And then here it says, class, hay una chica. And that means, class, there is a young girl. And then the teacher says, hay una chica. And the question is like, is that a young girl? And the answer is, of course, sí. And then you ask, here it says, hay un chico. And the answer there is no, right? Because hay una chica. And then here's another question, hay una chica o hay un chico o una chica, which is like, is that a young boy or a young girl? And then the answer is hay una chica, right? And so it gives like, I guess, a lot of information about like how the verb is used, how to ask questions in like a pretty easy to understand way. And so I really like that. And so, it's telling us, yeah, repetitive and then interesting. So we want to talk about things that are interesting to people. And so they have lots of things about like personalizing the input, like talking about yourself, like you could say, oh, I don't know, eres una chica, which is like, are you a young girl? And then, like, so that's like you ask someone, eres una chica? And then they say, no, hay un chico or something. And then acting out the story. And so then one of the things that I thought was most interesting about this was like they were talking about like the sort of input that you want to give people, which I guess I had never really had thought a whole lot about, right? You want to give people like, I mean, they talk a lot about easily recognizable cognates, which of course, when you're working with an indigenous language, there are probably none of those. But it's nice though, because you're like pairing your like talking with a picture, right? So there's like all these things for someone to reference if they don't understand what's going on. And then, I was thinking about something just now. Yeah. What was I thinking about? I guess for me, so yeah, that's all I got about sharing that. How do I stop? Right, oh, right there. So I guess for me, some of the limitations of it are in Tlingit, the verb changes drastically from a positive answer to a negative answer. Like when I say yuk a versus like which means like it's good and then it's not good, right? So like it's in Tlingit that is a hard thing to learn, that, you know, like that variation of the verb stem and or the verb root, and it sounds like something completely different. And so I think that like I think that like that's a limitation for at least for us in as Tlingit folks, because you can only do TPRS with things that you have taught them how to say, and so you can't actually ask them questions that have a no answer, because they won't know how to conjugate the verb, or when they do, you'll have to correct them. And sort of the point I think of a lot of TPRS exercises is to like have minimal correction and like have like a high success sort of situation where folks feel like I can use the language, you know? And so you have to in Tlingit avoid any questions that have an answer that's no.
Sheesh. So for everybody in class, let me ask you this. Can you tell me in one short sentence, what is TPR?
Total physical response. So very much physical demonstration connected with words where you're expected to be followed for familiarity through like physical familiarity attached to the vocabulary.
Absolutely. So, yeah, so TPR is, I'm gonna, and it's usually explained quite a bit before we even start. It's a good early in the semester type of tool or early in the classroom to get folks sort of started. Some of the driving philosophies are listening and not really speaking, just being there with the language, and also visual representation. So I'll say, um, and so then I would point at the door, and so you would see what I'm doing, and you would also do what I'm doing, and then hear the phrase. And there's lots of repetition, lots and lots of repetition as they do that. And that's kind of the TPR basic. There's a lot of stuff: stand up, sit down, go over here, go over there, with the limitations being it's using mostly command forms, and for a lot of indigenous languages, the command form of a verb is very different than sort of once you start moving the verb around. But the idea is to get folks up and moving and also just practice listening. There's not a lot of pressure to respond. As a language teacher, you're always going to have to think about, when do I expect people to talk? When do I call on them to talk in front of everybody? When are they going to just sort of share stuff that they put together? Or are they going to read something that's already been written? And then how am I going to give feedback on that? My general recommendation is to really hold back on any corrections, but instead turn those into future lessons. And if you could do so in a way that doesn't embarrass people, like the other day we heard this, and then you just quote them directly, and then you sort of talk about how it's wrong. Like, really avoid that stuff, but instead find a way to incorporate the lesson so it's just kind of a smooth thing. So in a sentence, what is TPRS? If I said, tell me what it is, I only got 30 seconds.
The teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. Just from a lot more of what I was seeing too is a lot of storytelling. Really just so the students can read it along with that story. I mean, that's a big part of like with the culture too. The other, I guess a lot of other examples I've seen where, it's really just telling them a story and then they're learning from that, kind of like what they're doing. I think at TCL too is some TPRS, but other language programs all over are doing really great with just TPRS. But on like the same hand, a lot of them that are doing better are incorporating more than just one. Like TPR or TPRS is just like one part of it, and they're integrating all of them. And
Yeah.
seems like they're having better success with that than just sticking with one.
And they have very similar acronyms. So I used to, in my mind, it was like, oh, it's like TPR with storytelling, but it's a pretty much a different mechanism, right? So this one, you're expecting a back and forth. It's really built upon a question and answer sort of structure. For example, and you could take short little stories. So there's a group called Children of the Taku River Society, and they're trying to teach. They use the Paul Creek method, which we'll get to. And when we talk about these methodologies, just remember these are simply just tools for you to have that are proving to be effective with language communities. And so as far as how your language group incorporates this, whether we're talking about at a classroom level, for immersion gatherings, for practice with fellow learners, or to encourage practice with the learners that you are teaching, it's totally up to you. But just don't think that this is the primary foundation of the program. It's a tool to use. It's not the vehicle. But you could take something like this. So this is told by Keiichi, Bessie Cooley, and we could do some things like the first time through. Maybe we take a look at the story itself, and then we listen to her saying these sentences, and maybe that's step one. And then ideally, the further you can push people in the language. So this one says "Tsakidi ka khatlakach wush khunich has sati." So this is Tsakidi right here. It's a beaver. This is khatlakach, and so that's porcupine. So then you could do some stuff by saying the idea is to sort of do a framework. So they if they know adu sawe in Tlingit, which is who's this. So if you said adu sawe, they could say tsagedi awe, adu sawe, chatlakach awe. And then they see it right here. And then you could say adu sa wush chunich sati. Who are friends. And so it's built off the same verb. I'm not going to introduce some new phrase, but I'm going to try and figure out how many questions could I target off of this particular sentence. And so who are friends, and they could say "Tsegedi kachatlakach, wushchunich hasati again, Tsegedi kachatlakach." Are they friends? Yes, they're friends, and so most things are built right onto here. So it's not going to say where is the beaver's house because it's not in there. Like they should be able to mine almost everything out of there, and you can go to the next one. Chatlakach tsegedi hiti dewuku. So Porcupine went to Beaver's house. Aduhiti sawe, adewugu tchatlakach. Whose house did Tchatlakach go to? Adusa, aduchsa, tsegeti hiti dewugu. Who went to Beaver's house? Gudesa wugu tchatlakach. Where did the porcupine go? And so you can just sort of, as you look at this, you could brainstorm and figure these things out, and you should be able to do this whole question and answer thing without using any English. So when we look at these methodologies, a lot of them are developed so that we can rely less on English and have basically a communication technology is what it is, so that we can talk to our folks. And so this was a short story that group had recorded. I was doing some work with them where basically they would record speakers and send it to me, and I would write down what they're saying so they could teach to what the elders are saying. They use a lot of stuff to try and minimize the English, and it's really interesting because when they first started, the proficiency of their teachers wasn't all that high, but they were able to sort of build a curriculum, and then they are learning as they're teaching, which is really fascinating because in their community, there are at this time, no speakers with high fluency. So then I took this and I wanted to mess around, and so I said, how about can I illustrate this story? And then, and was just practicing trying to draw some stuff. And I know some of you are artists. I know some of you are storytellers. I know some of you have probably access to speakers. So you could do this. And I think depending on what level, like this could even work for adults, this could work for kids. Uh, the big thing is like sort of like how complex are the concepts going to get? And even if you get to some stuff like this, it gets a little complicated, even for folks who've been studying Tlingit for a while, unless they've seen it already. Because this is Porcupine left some of his quills there, and it's talking about at Beaver's house. And so the way it gets complicated is our word for porcupine quill is the same word for hair. And then when he left it there, it sounds like he dropped it there because those use the same verbs. But then the same thing, you come back to here, you say adusa jiwanak bichawu, who left their hair or quill. Dasa ajiwanak vechatlakach, what did porcupine drop? And then as teachers, it gives you a lot of room to sort of figure out how do I, because you got to rearrange a bunch of stuff in Tlingit when you ask that question. And then the student should be, and one of the tools that I think you could use here, if you said, if you said something and they said it back and there was something about the word order that needed to be fixed, you can repeat it back to them without having to pull out and correct in English. But so instead of, I think a lot of these methodologies push for very light corrections as people get started, and also being very conscious that people are nervous, people are shy, so you don't want to get them standing up and speaking in front of people right away. Other thoughts on TPRS? Your perspectives, your ideas, how you might use it?
There were some parts of that video that I know probably it wasn't all really like TPRS the best, but there were some words that there's like just no word for, like click here, just the word click. Like I don't know how we can, coming up with words like that.
Yeah.
In all these other classes too, like we talked about, like having elders there, but really an elder doesn't know click what, what are you talking about? And it's really like, we know what it is because we know you mean click the mouse and not anything else. But it'd be hard, I guess, to come up with some of those words too.
Yeah, and there could be things like my general philosophy, it's always, I think it's fine to be using English words in the indigenous languages grammar. It's better than the other way around, where you're just using some, hand me the gukha. I, I would rather have it, achchite way iPhone. That second one I think is better because it's using the indigenous verbal structure and everything, as opposed to just using the indigenous name for something in the English language. But then as you sort of go forward, you're going to find a bunch of blank spots, and that's going to bring you back to your new word development process and how you're going to do that. Like I would probably recommend kanalcheir for clicking something. It means to press it with your finger, which is, the mouse is an extension of the finger. I think at is a thing that points at something, and that's what an elder had named the cursor on a computer when you move the cursor around. But one of the goals, so some of the things that we're talking about here, like let's say we have the beginning of a language class if you're teaching adults. And so day one, you want them to be hearing quite a bit of the language. So how do you sort of get them to be around the language quite a bit, but not be totally disoriented? They're going to be disoriented, but how do you minimize that? And then, and even if you're, what they said about the aha punanaleo, like, I'll ask Yvonne if you're ready to answer a question. Let's say your folks' language nest was going, and I say, I'm moving back to Fairbanks, and since I'm in Fairbanks, I'm going to have my kids go to Gwich'in language nest. And if I just drop my kid in there, how long do you think before they're understanding what you folks are saying and responding appropriately?
I would say it would depend on the age, because some of our kids are still not speaking yet. So they're still responding, right? So if we tell them to go pick your cup up from over there and put it back on top of the table where it belongs, they'll go and pick up the cup and put it over there. So they're responding, I guess, just through action, but not through verbal responses quite yet, because they're not speaking. I would say when we started, it was within about 2 weeks till there was starting to be comprehension, and probably within a month, we were already seeing like tangible progress, and which was just amazing to us to see, that, within a month and within a couple months, it was like they were already starting to understand what I would consider like some more complex commands, because a lot of what we were doing were commands and questions related to playing, eating, sleeping, things like that, and cleaning things up, putting things away, the stuff you do with little babies in a in a playroom space. So, but the interesting thing for me is that as an adult learner and thinking about adult learners progression, and the types of things that are being taught to adult learners oftentimes are quite different, because you're teaching them about, and we're still doing some of this with in the chato, but things like the kinship and greetings and feelings, and and so, but in the chato, because you're dealing with little kids, they're learning more things like, are you hurt? What happened? Where does it hurt? Do you need to use the bathroom? Like things that you just really need to do. Whereas in the adult classroom, you're usually not prioritizing those sorts of, it seems like anyways, those sorts of common phrases and things that you really need to communicate with each other, I think, at some point in time, but is not regularly communicated between adults. So anyways, that was more than you asked for, but yeah, I would say it would take a couple weeks to a month probably before the kids were starting to comprehend and kind of be able to start being functional in the space.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking, and that's what we found with our kids in our nest as well. Is the first, and it's really difficult. It's really difficult to talk to someone and to know that they can't understand you. And so I do think it's an act of kindness to usually translate for them right away. And so when you're dealing with kids, like when you drop them into like a nest, and we had some kids who came in late when we got started and stuff, and so as kids came in, you would be accommodating to them and really work with them to get them to understand things that you're saying. But it was really interesting that we could see some children who they couldn't understand a single word that we said. And then, yeah, 3 weeks in, they can understand almost everything we're telling them, which it's mind blowing to see. And then within 2 months, I think they're talking quite a bit. I think the folks in Hawaii said they're pretty confident you could take any kid from anywhere, you drop them into their language nest, and they'll be speaking Hawaiian in 3 months. That was kind of their inside scoop. I don't know if they would advertise that, but then so you've got to build this atmosphere that's good for the kids. So you drop a new kid in there, and you can get them going along and using the type of language that you're looking for and talking about the things that you're talking about. And then when you have adults, you've got a different trajectory, but I think you're trying to figure out how to expose them to as much of the language as possible while doing these sort of building blocks. And whatever language you're working in, your program is going to have to develop this sort of driving philosophy. What's the philosophy of teaching your language? And it's, when do you get to the grammar and how do you get to the grammar? Because there's a lot of list building, which is vocabulary. What's this called? What's that called? What's this, and a lot of it's day-to-day stuff, like a pen, a spoon, a fork, a bowl, a cup, a bunch of things that you're going to use on a day-to-day basis. But then you're going to get into what you do with these things. And then you're going to get into sort of trying to bring the language into these realms. Like, okay, we're going to learn how to hunt a moose and clean it and prepare all the meat and do everything. And and then there's a bunch of cultural stuff in there as well. Like, what do we do once we kill it? And what do we do once we're done cleaning it? And what do we do as far as distributing the meat to the community? And so, but one of the things, like say if you were teaching at a university, it's pretty common to have a beginning one, beginning two, intermediate one, intermediate two, advanced one, advanced two. So you've got these 6 semesters. So the philosophy in Hawaii is by semester 4, so it's your second semester of the intermediate class, you don't use English anymore. You're just done with it. And we're not there. We try to push ourselves. So in advanced Tlingit, we basically spend an hour in Tlingit, and we spend 30 minutes working on some sort of lesson. That's kind of usually the goal. And so the other thing is when you're dealing with adults, then you develop ideally topic classes so that you have a class that's Tsimshian literature, where you just look at stories and you listen to them and you talk about them entirely in the language. Or you could have a class on Haida spirituality. What are the beliefs, and then what are the newer beliefs, and where's the middle ground between Christianity and Haida beliefs? And could you do all that stuff in Haida? And then you can also have some classes that just sort of, I think, look at just bring in a newspaper and have someone point out a story and everybody read it for a second, talk about it in the language. Could we talk about global warming? And could we talk about mask, no mask? And could we talk, on and on? And it doesn't always have to be the super hot button contentious things like abortion and the drinking age. Like if you ever taught college writing, you're just gonna get abortion. You guys gotta say, don't write about abortion or the drinking age, or nowadays I'd say don't write about whether you should have to mandate vaccines and stuff. Just it's just like the argument's so deeply settled that it's difficult to do that. But I think nuanced stuff will be pretty fun. Like who's gonna win the baseball game tonight and why do you think so? But then you got to realize a bunch of stuff that you got to figure out how to say as well, which I think is really interesting. And these methodologies, they do help. I think you can't teach a whole language through any of these particular methodologies, I don't think. But you can certainly figure out how am I going to use them and when. And for me, there are a lot of sort of warm-up stuff to, but it's going to be up to you as well, both individually as a language teacher with your own idea of your personal pedagogy, which is this is my approach to teaching the language, from like the overall big picture stuff to a single class, and also like my own preparation and how I sort of do stuff. Because if you're teaching, you could find yourself in a situation where you're teaching 40, 50 people every single day, and then you're just trying to keep yourself grounded. Because like, what did I teach this group, and then this group, and then what was I teaching this group, and these guys, and you might have advanced courses too, where you've got people who are taking it for the second, third, fourth time, because they're just trying to keep going, because the languages are often so deep and complex, and we're trying to bring so many people along from the very beginning that sometimes it's hard to figure out, like, what now? What now? It's not like there's a textbook for each of our languages. But I do believe, like, if you're looking at developing curriculum, looking at these methodologies, and then probably developing a workbook to learn from for adults, and then probably looking at developing a dictionary that's controlled and maintained by the community and that can be regularly updated, and then a grammar, which is this is how we teach the ins and outs of the deep part of the language, where you're getting into pronouns and either prepositions or postpositions or whatever other types of things you have in your language. The other thing that you can do, I wanted to show you folks something else that comes from some of our southern neighbors, is this poster series that came out of a school district in Canada that's a Tsimshian language school district. And so as they got a series of illustrations that are, I think they're called the seasonal rounds posters, where they show people doing things that they do in this community based on the season. So they're getting clams and they're getting stuff off the beach and it looks like someone's fishing, and there's getting the smokehouse ready perhaps, and so a whole bunch of stuff about like what is relevant to the people. And then when these posters, I remember seeing these in the early 2000s, and a lot of our elders were really excited because they could get up and they could point at something, like you could say like these guys are hauling something up from the shore up to the inland, and they could say that, and then they could sort of they'll say dakte hasvuat, or you could say dakte has ausein. They brought it up from the ocean, and then we could repeat what the elder said, and so we were using some early like TPRS stuff when these poster series came out, and so I'd really recommend something like this to find some local artists and to draw stuff that just sort of whether it matches up to a particular month or particular time of year with a whole bunch of cultural activities that are really relevant to your community. So it could be fiddle dancing and it could be, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. And I guess for some of the kids, like when we're teaching kids, I think it's really interesting to me because there's some things that might be a little bit off limits for adults, depending on who you are and how your program is. But you're probably not teaching too many adults to say like, wipe your butt and did you flush the toilet and make sure you wash your hands. And there's a whole series of stuff that just has to do with sort of being a parent to these kids, which is when they advised us on a language nest, they said, make it a home. Don't worry about being in school. Don't focus on curriculum. Don't focus on your budget. All those things are distractions. I mean, you're going to feel like you need to know that stuff. And you're going to feel like we got to get all the curriculum. We got to get all that. And what they told us, they said, you just got to do it. You'll never be ready. You'll never be ready. But if you don't, then you'll also still never be ready. So you just got to go for it. And you create a home for these kids where the language of use is your Indigenous language. And you're going to have so many new things popping up and so many just issues that you might not have thought of just having kids in the same space, you know, like what if they start kind of forming these little groups and then this group is mean to that group and you got to sort of do some of that navigating as a basically almost a co-parent to the kids because you spend a lot of time with them and you're also going to be implementing a lot of cultural values. Thoughts?
Just because you're talking a lot about the language nests, some of the reading that I did or have been doing, not necessarily in this class, but was also talking about when you're starting up a language nest, don't start with more than like 4 kids in your first year. And we didn't read that before we launched our language nest, but just because the laws and regulations required us to only be able to have 4 infants with 1 caretaker or no more than 5, but no more than 4 within the state of Alaska until you get certified as a home daycare. We were already limited to 4 kids. And once things started moving, we realized that we're really grateful that we only have 4 kids in the during this first year because of the magnitude of all the other things. You mentioned some of them that we realized that we needed to focus on, not the least of which is really eliciting a lot of that early childhood language that hadn't been spoken for many decades. And then also just kind of refining, because it's probably similar in Tlingit. And I think I just heard you say 2 different ways of bringing something up from the ocean. There's often like 6 or 10 different ways you can say many different things within Gwich'in as well. But we wanted to be consistent with the way that we were saying things with kids, but then also with the student, other people. So we're also kind of going through this process of like, all right, this is the way we're going to say this, and we're just going to stick to this way of saying it, so that at this stage it's clear once the kids are comprehending us that we're all saying things the same way. And then also, what words are we going to use for things that's more kids language than maybe when they become adults we might use a more adult way of saying something, like the bathroom, because there's like a kid's way of saying the bathroom, and then there's like an adult way of saying the bathroom, and the adult way is a bit more complicated to say and is a bit more of a mouthful, so we stuck with the kids way, which is, makes sense. So anyways, I think that it's really accurate that there's just so many different things, and I love that we're learning more about these different methods, because I think that we're at a stage now where the older kids now have all turned 3 years old, which is 2 of them. So half of them are now 2 and half of them are now three. And we're thinking more about, what are the tools that we're going to really need to use to progress our language knowledge and learning, and the methods through which we're going to be more formally teaching, because mostly we have a home. Like you said, it's like we have a home, we have a lot of stuff to play with, we have a lot of activities. We actually put, similar to that poster you showed, seasonal pictures up on the wall of, like, when it was salmon time, there'd be pictures of salmon and making dry fish and making half dried fish and making, baking fish, and, like, berry picking time. And so that we had something to reference and talk about with in regards to the seasons, and the activities that happen during those seasons. But I think that we're really excited about, how much there is that are possibilities with which we can do and take steps forward. It's just kind of determining what are the things with our limited capacity and time and energy that we choose to focus on advancing, as you had mentioned, kind of the nailing down kind of methods for teaching grammar, building out a usable dictionary, building curriculum, writing books. And as you know, even a children's book it takes a lot of time and energy to put it together. And so, but it's exciting to see kind of what other people have done, for inspiration and ideas as kind of where we can go with producing materials. And I think the last thing I'll say is that we're also kind of in a dynamic where we're, two of the three of us are very much just language learners still. And so we're constantly in a situation where we're not really able to say yet what we might want to say in the space of the chatto. And so we're also kind of just collecting all of these, phrases and things that we need to learn how to say, and, simultaneously. And it is tough sometimes, because we do introduce, of course, new words pretty regularly in the chatto with the kids there, either in speaking with each other, or, like, for example, my daughter came in and one of the kids knew my daughter and said, "Oh, Shek, Nana Ez." She said to the teacher, "Hey, teacher, this is Nana Ez." She knew who she was, and then I told her, "Oh yeah, this is my daughter." But they'd never heard me say "this is my daughter" to someone, and they just looked at me like, "What?" They're like, "Whatever," and then they just went back to doing whatever they're doing, and it made me realize, oh, I need to get like a picture of, like, me and my daughters and whatever, and then I can, like, show them, maybe, and maybe I'll do this next week or something, so that can be like, she, and then should she, and she didn't she, and they can see, and maybe start making the connections, because we try not to explain in English what it is that we're saying in the language in the space. We just use the language, and through repetition, the ideas that they have been, learning to comprehend through the language rather than through kind of like translating things in their mind, I think.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that we can sort of borrow from early childhood education and programs that do a lot with younger kids. And some of that is we never know what kids are going through in their home lives as well. And so the language nest is also sometimes a real opportunity to provide stability. And so I know we had some kids they were teasing another kid because they said, "You don't have a dad." And I don't know if they're really teasing or if they're just being, sometimes kids are just matter of fact, right? Like, "Oh, you don't have a dad." And so then we had to kind of jump in because we could see that the kid had their feelings hurt and stuff. But then also sometimes when we bring out the kinship and the other things, we used to have like laws about who could marry whom and how all that stuff works. And sometimes we'll still talk about that stuff, but then we have to be a little bit careful because kids might have they might have violated the old clan laws in terms of who you could marry. And those are also discussions that the language community and the cultural communities are going to have to talk about, because you might have your language community and you might have your culture community, and there might not be the same communities. There might be folks working on the language who don't know a whole lot about the cultural stuff, or they're not the ones who are the selected or inherited leaders, however it works. And then you could have your folks who are the cultural leaders and stuff, but they might not know the language. So you might have a lot of these sort of disconnects in these other areas. And so like I've had some folks who are involved with leadership, with their clan, and they'll reach out to me and they'll say, "Could you teach me the language, but don't teach me all this stuff you teach the other guys. That's just boring to me." And I'm like, well, we all got to take these steps. I understand what you're trying to do, but if you're trying to get me to be your speechwriter, then I'm not really interested in that. I am interested in leaders who want to become speakers and everybody. But the other thing that Fishman talked about is every culture has its role relations, right? So you got uncle, auntie, parents, that's kinship. But then you also have, however your particular group works, you might have clan relationships or village relationships or other things like that. Some of those things are going to have to become a little bit flexible when you come in because you might be teaching your auntie the language, or it gets interesting too because sometimes some of that stuff has to get set aside, or someone could be in a really high leadership position. They're going to have to find a way to humble themselves to come into that door of the classroom where they don't know as much as other people, and that could create awkward feelings and situations, and some of those things sometimes need to be discussed as well. And then as you start developing your adults, there's a reality here that if your language has not produced high level fluency speakers, then odds are pretty good that nobody knows how to do that anymore. And odds are, we found here, they didn't know how to really, to be honest, to talk to children in the language. That's because that was taken from us when they took the language away, and when our people also decided, like, we won't teach the kids anymore so that they're not going to get abused by these school teachers and religious people. So then you have this huge, these these disconnects all over the place. And so as we sort of look at trying to mend all of those things as language teachers, a lot of our work is in doing that work of nudging things back together, but at the same time figuring out what are they now? Because I was asked to give testimony, and I gave some testimony about this language teacher pathway, and then there was a state representative who asked me a question, and she said, "How do you balance the modern of the English with the ancient of the Alaska Native language?" And so I had to think. I have to be careful. I don't want to like make fun of people or laugh at them because I could embarrass them, and they might get mad, and they also might get hurt feelings, and maybe there's just a tremendous lack of education throughout Alaska about Indigenous peoples and languages, colonialism. So he said, well, there's a bit of a stereotype there that English is modern and Alaska Native is ancient. But there's a little bit of truth there as well because our languages were banished. So we didn't get to be part of the conversation of the rest of the world, talking about a whole bunch of stuff, math and science and the astronomy and a whole bunch of stuff that I wish our elders could have talked about a lot more and come up with terms for things like everybody else. They didn't have terms for this stuff, and then they made them. It's not like all those things were just there with them forever. And so as we the modernization of our languages is going to take some work as we sort of look at some of this stuff. And you're also going to have points where once the youth start to speak your language, they're going to make it their own. And you got to be kind of ready for that. So they're going to just say they're going to say tsuye, and that's going to be their way of saying goodbye. And for you as a language teacher, you might say, that doesn't mean anything, I'm grumpy. But then you got to sort of let them have it. Let them have it because they're claiming the language as their own, which is important. And so it's always these balancing acts, I think, of all these different things. And so everybody else got I got some other stuff we can look at too. I just want to check it. Duck juice.
Yeah, I'm happy that you said that Aunt Dolores, she was with her brother who was Chief Kula, and Aunt Dolores said to him, those young people aren't speaking Haida correctly. And her brother said, don't worry about it. They are speaking their own hot kill. And Dolores always has wise things to say. As far as the kids learning hot kill, she also said, not to teach them things like, oh, you know, this is a snow goose, or this is a turtle, or this is a blanket, but to teach them the language that they would use in everyday life, because that's how young kids learn the language. And I was reading the one on the Arapaho language, and it took some time, like 3 or 4 years, to get to a better place with getting the kids to start thinking and speaking in Arapaho. If you're in the classroom and you teach them, this is a desk, this is a chalkboard, this is a window, are they going to speak Arapaho outside of school? Probably not. And they found that to be true. So they tried some things, and they had to bring in an immersion trainer, and then they started doing videos and to track the progress. And after trying proven immersion methods, the students, like a student would run up to the teacher and say, oh, I hurt my knee or something like that, but they wouldn't be speaking English. They would be speaking in Arapaho. So they gave them the tools to start thinking in their own language. Okay, I'm going to stop talking.
Wow. No, that's great stuff. That's great stuff. And so there's a couple things that I think about. One is, so if we go back in time in our minds, right? Let's just go back 200 years and think about any of our particular indigenous languages in Alaska, right? So Alaska's got a bit of a different history than the lower 48. But if you go back a couple hundred years, everywhere you go in Alaska, 100% of the people speak the indigenous language. Just everybody. Everybody speaks the language, which is so wild to think about. Like, so think about wherever you consider your home community. So think of what that community might look like. Every single person speaks the language. For as long as there have been indigenous people, there's been intermarriage and travel and newcomers. Like, I don't know, they could get kicked out of their community, or maybe they just said, I'm leaving, I'm gonna go look at the world. And we got all kinds of stories about travelers going all over the place. So someone would show up and maybe they come move into your community and they're gonna learn your language. They don't know it, they're an adult. And so as they learn the language, some people are gonna sort of have fun and maybe tease them a little bit, but they're gonna watch them internalize this language, speak it incorrectly for so long, and then eventually become a speaker of it. But because we haven't seen that for like probably 2 whole generations for some of our languages, for our people, it's a very strange thing to see. But I think because we're not talking about that process and just saying it's normal. It's normal for someone to learn a language and to not be very capable in it, and then to become capable even as adults. But I think some of our instincts now become to stop it once they hear it being wrong, or to say they're doing it wrong, they're getting it wrong, they're teaching it wrong, they're changing it. they're breaking it. And so there's a whole bunch of this stuff that comes about, which pushes people to to sort of to stop. But I think we have to be comfortable with this fact. So when they started teaching us Hawaiian, they said, okay, you're going to learn the artificial form of Hawaiian. You're not going to sound like the Hawaiians. If people hear you talk, they're going to tell you it doesn't sound right to them. And that's okay, because you're internalizing and you're building a whole grammar in your mind. But if the community can just be okay and just trust the idea that the more that they learn and the more, if we can create it, turn it into a language of use, which is, I think the bulk of our work is to make it a language of use, because then collectively we'll all figure out a whole bunch of this stuff. And some of it is guiding folks and creating lessons based on what you're hearing as a teacher. Part of it is self-monitoring. As you learn something new, you're like, oh, okay, that's how this one little thing works. How cool. Then you'll catch yourself using it incorrectly. But the more you sort of think of, you'll start to sort of self-correct in some of those things. And one of the biggest things, if your language has not created speakers in a long time, of a high fluency, even if you got 1,000 speakers right now, to start doing that and to go from English to the indigenous language, you're going to have to come up with processes, which I don't think these methodologies address yet. How do we get someone to finally stop thinking in English, translating everything both directions, and just give themselves over? So it just leans completely over to the indigenous language. And the way I usually hear this talked about is people say, I can understand what they're saying, but after about 5 minutes, I suddenly find I can't understand it anymore. And what I usually say is, I think you're translating everything. And then your brain is getting a little bit tired of just, because it's switching every single thing over to English, and then preparing the thoughts in English, and then switching it back over into the indigenous language. So getting people to sort of push all the way over, and then creating these language use areas, those are two of the big challenges. I was catching up with what Yvonne put in the chat. So as we start to wrap up today, I wanted us to sort of, well, I guess maybe I'll do something that's a little more straightforward, which was finishing some of these thoughts on language documentation. We're in the process of writing some grants right here so we could pick up a book scanner, because we got a bunch of old books that some of them have to do with our artworks, some of them have to do with our language, and we want to be able to scan them and make sure that we have an adequate, a good process of creating PDFs that we can just get out to people. Because you put everything on like a little tablet, just like a little piece of glass now. It's so wild. And not that that's the answer for everybody. Some people want to have the books in their hands, but there's so much stuff you could just put in there. And in terms of creating more content, like whether talking about children's literature, adult literature, dictionaries, whatever, coming up with processes of doing, just getting it out there, fixing the errors as you go, doing really low runs, like basically print on demand, so you don't have to buy 1,000 copies of it, and then when you find that error on page 50, you don't have to like crawl in a hole, because you just make it as much as you need for the time, and then you fix it, and then you just make another one. There's so many self-publishing options right now, and just go try some of them out. I do think I used to use one called Lulu a lot, but now I think that was called. But now I use Kindle, which I know probably supports the Juggernaut system, but it's easy. It's relatively easy to use, and you get results pretty fast. It's pretty high quality. But some of the things that you might have larger things, you might have, you're gonna have to have someone who gets to know how to use this machine as well. So you don't have a book with a PDF that's giant because it's got big black space all around where you just got this little tiny book and you gotta zoom way in. or the first page is gigantic and the other pages are small. You're going to have someone who's in control of the PDF if it needs to be updated, like if you're running your own dictionary. Audio and video. I think it's good to have it as high quality as you can, but there's always a million new options for cameras. If you're going 1080p or 4K or 6K or however many K are coming after that, your storage is going to have to be something you figure out because they're huge. They're huge, huge files. Also making sure, like we had this room full of people, and each one of these elders shared something, and this one is gone, this one is gone, this one is gone. I think this one is gone. Like there's quite like half of them are probably gone now. And I wish I would have taped a little microphone. I wish I would have thought about how to, because it's so boomy in the room, and so thinking about like how to get the right quality of audio and video, because once you do it, you can't go back and do it again sometimes. But making sure also that you've got someone who can run the gear for you, and you've got someone who can, and this looks very invasive, but maybe it doesn't have to be so invasive. I don't know. And then thinking about archives. Where do you keep these? There's the Alaska Native Language Center, the Alaska Native Language Archives. In our region, Alaska Heritage has archives. But how are you going to make sure that this stuff is protected, it can transfer, it's easy to find, we just don't want to lose stuff, I think. We don't want to lose stuff, but we also want to think about what is this stuff going to be used for? Can we keep diving back into this stuff to pull out lessons? So this TPRS stuff could come right from stories we already have recorded. So we might take a story and think and it's very complicated, but what we're working on is creating some bite-sized versions, which, no offense to adult learners, but we're going to put it in the language nest for the kids, but we're also going to put it into the beginning language class for the adults. But I think there's a benefit to that because some of those adults are going to have kids in the nest, and they're all going to be seeing the same things, and they could read it together and learn together. And again, these role relations sometimes shift, where you got kids teaching the language to their parents, it's a beautiful thing, but it can also be a little bit disorienting. And then lastly is you're going to have to have someone who can work with audio and who can work with video. Hey, we got this rumbling noise in here because the heater was going while we recorded this. Can you get that sound out of there? And we talked a little bit in here about the two programs I use to get sounds out of things is primarily Isotope is what the program is called. And then the second one is called Adobe Audition. And then for video, it just varies. I'm probably leaning towards DaVinci these days, but it just depends on what kinds of stuff you're doing. Because some people, they say, like, I'm not a videographer. I just want to put the video thing up there, hit the button, and just let it go. I don't care about lighting or anything else. But also, if you're going to make a shot, like, maybe do a bit of that. Have some lights and think about the type of microphone you're going to use and how it's going to be different if you're recording 1 or 2 speakers or if you're going to record 10 different speakers because you've got them together. And for some of our languages, if you got 10 speakers in a room, you might not ever have that many again. So you've got to be able to capture what they're saying. And you've also got to be able to become skilled at getting them to talk once the camera or the recorder turns on, if that's what they want to do. A lot of our elders in this region, when people first started recording them, they didn't want to be recorded. But the more that it happened and the more they realized that we were losing the language, they wanted to be recorded. And so usually I will say in our language, thank you for taking the time, be brave. What do you want your grandchildren to know? Because if you tell us, we'll do our best to try and teach them. And then that usually tends to open them up quite a bit. And if they know that whoever's recording them can understand the language, that might push them to go a little farther. Because sometimes if they look and they see that sort of glossed over eyes because you don't know what they're saying, then they might just stop. And that's the other thing too, is if you have speakers, sometimes you got to push them to go beyond the level of the learners so that the learners can, catch up to that eventually. So that covers a lot, folks. I appreciate the presentation on TPRS. 2 weeks from now, we're going to look at, I believe it's Where Are Your Keys? Let me just pull that up. Yeah, Where Are Your Keys with Nila Toka, Salaktana, and Doug Juice. So be ready, you got 2 weeks. But Monday, we're going to have a panel discussion. I'm excited about it. Just got confirmation of another speaker, Michael D'Angeli. So I'm excited to have that time. We're going to open the class up and invite the public in. There may or may not be extra folks here hanging out with us. And as usual, we're going to record it and put it up for folks later. We might live stream it. I might mess around with that and see how it works. So any other thoughts or questions before we go?
I had a question about the next class, but I guess I can wait for a minute. Is the next class, is it in person or is it just on Zoom?
It's both.
Advanced Tlingit.
Well, tonight we're having a super class.
Yeah.
So we're combining all sections of Tlingit all at once. So it'll be both. You can be in this room or the next room, or you could be on Zoom, whichever you prefer. Okay, thanks for all your work. Enjoy the week 8 readings. Don't forget about them. And see you folks on Monday.
We go in
Well,
direction.
Deutschen. Hau a, kaya anak ng cheese.